My daughter-in-law handed my wife an 18-dish Thanksgiving list and expected her to handle every bit of it solo. So I put us both on a first-class flight to St. Simon's Island, Georgia, and left one note sitting on the bare dining room floor. The screaming phone call reached us right as we were seated at dinner by the water. The name's Conrad Huxley, 66 years old, and for 4 decades I made my career as a forensic auditor, hunting hidden assets on behalf of the federal courts. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, where the people who stayed quiet the longest tend to speak the loudest in the end. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found your way. Go ahead and subscribe so the next story comes straight to you. I'd hate for you to miss what's coming. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment and tell me in one line whether you think a parent should ever cut a child off completely or if blood always deserves another chance. I genuinely love to read what you think. One quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. It's the truth inside the story that matters. It reeked of profound disrespect. I stood in the doorway of our own house, watching the woman I have loved for 42 years buckle under the weight of our son's arrogance. Elaine was at the sink, her slight hands trembling as she scrubbed crusted porcelain plates. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. A sharp, involuntary wince crossed her face, a painful reminder of the double knee replacement she had endured just 10 months ago. 10 months of grueling physical therapy. 10 months of relearning how to move without agony. And here she stood anchored to a basin of cold, greasy water, cleaning up the wreckage of a dinner party our daughter-in-law Priya had thrown the night before. Priya had insisted on using our spacious suburban home outside Atlanta to entertain her friends, claiming her own apartment was too cramped. Elaine, always the peacemaker, had said yes. Elaine had stayed out of the way, and now Elaine was paying the physical price. I watched the tremor moving through my wife's shoulders. I watched how she pressed herself heavily against the marble counter just to stay upright. The anger that took hold in my chest was not a sudden explosion. It was a cold, creeping frost. It was 40 years of blind paternal leniency finally crystallizing into something absolute. I crossed the kitchen. I said nothing. I quietly but firmly took the abrasive sponge from her wet, shaking hands. I shut off the faucet. The silence that fell over the kitchen was thick and heavy. I guided Elaine by the waist, steering her away from the sink and settling her into the padded chair at the kitchen island. I passed her a towel to dry her hands. I pulled out my phone and called my son, Derek. It rang 3 times before he picked up. The ambient noise of Derek's downtown financial office in Midtown Atlanta hummed through the line. I skipped any greeting. My voice was a low, controlled hum, a tone I had kept in reserve for hostile witnesses throughout my auditing years. I told Derek to contact a professional cleaning service immediately. I told him to have them at my house within the hour to deal with the mess his wife had left behind. I expected an apology. I expected the son I raised to grasp the sheer entitlement of leaving his recovering mother to scrub his wife's wine glasses. Derek scoffed. The sound was sharp, dismissive, and completely stripped of respect. He told me I was blowing things out of proportion. He claimed Priya was simply too overwhelmed at the moment, frantically getting ready for her wealthy parents' upcoming holiday visit. He told me to stop making a scene over a few dirty plates, adding that Elaine could use the movement to keep her joints from stiffening. He addressed me not as a father, but as an inconvenience. He spoke of his mother not as a person in pain, but as an unpaid domestic worker who ought to be thankful for the task. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply ended the call. The line went dead. Quiet settled back over the kitchen. I looked at Elaine. She was rubbing her aching knees, her gaze fixed on the floor to hide her tears. In that precise moment, my son stopped being my son. He became a liability. He became a target. I left Elaine to rest with a cup of hot tea and withdrew to my study. The room was lined with thick leather-bound volumes and heavy mahogany shelves, a sanctuary built on logic, numbers, and accountability. I opened my laptop. The glow of the screen fell across the dark wood of my desk. Before retirement, I spent 4 decades dismantling corporate fraud. I had made my life hunting phantom assets, uncovering hidden ledgers, and exposing men who believed their greed was well enough buried. I understood how money moved. I knew how liars operated. I logged into the joint emergency bank account, a high-yield savings account I had set up for Derek years earlier, with my name still on it as the primary guarantor. It was a safety net. More precisely, it was a safety net established strictly for Elaine's ongoing medical expenses. Her co-pays, her premium physical therapy sessions, and the surgeries we knew might still lie ahead. It was the wall I had constructed around my wife's health. I pulled up the transaction history. The numbers did not add up. The balance was drastically, horrifyingly low. A systematic bleed revealed itself in cold digital ink. I studied the screen, my eyes moving down the lines of data. Thousands of dollars had been siphoned away in untraceable rolling transfers over the previous 6 months. This was not a single desperate withdrawal driven by a genuine crisis. It was a calculated, methodical extraction. Precise amounts engineered to slide just beneath the threshold of automated bank alerts. I did not panic. I became an auditor. I traced the routing numbers. I followed the digital trail through the banking network. The destination was an auto dealership, a luxury European auto dealership in Buckhead, Atlanta. Derek had been draining his mother's surgical recovery fund to lease a top-tier luxury SUV. He was bleeding the money set aside for Elaine's physical therapy to bankroll a leather-seated status symbol to impress Priya's parents. The betrayal shifted in my mind. It moved from emotional negligence into outright calculated theft. Derek had looked at his mother's suffering, looked at the money meant to ease that suffering, and concluded that his wife's vanity ranked higher. He had stolen her comfort to buy a facade. I sat in the stillness of my study. The blue light of the screen reflected in my eyes. I felt no sorrow. What I felt was the absolute terrifying clarity of a man who has just been handed permission to destroy. The heavy thud of the front door thrown open shattered the quiet of the house. No knock, no greeting. Priya came striding into the living room, her designer heels striking our hardwood floors with sharp, aggressive force. The sound was a rhythmic, invasive tapping that carried through every hallway. She ignored me entirely as I stepped out of my study, did not so much as glance in my direction. She went straight to the kitchen where Elaine was still resting. Priya reached into her expensive handbag and produced a thick cream-colored envelope. The paper was embossed heavy and ostentatious. She dropped it onto the coffee table in front of Elaine. It landed with a dull smack. Priya crossed her arms and looked down at my wife with an expression soaked in condescension. She was not making a request. She was issuing a directive. She demanded that Elaine cancel her physical therapy appointments for the entire following week. She declared that the house needed to be scrubbed, reorganized, and flawlessly staged for her parents' imminent arrival. Her tone was sharp, brittle, and completely absent of basic human decency. I stepped between them. I put my body between my recovering wife and the woman who treated her as a disposable resource. My eyes met Priya's. I kept my posture easy, but my voice carried the hardness of granite. I told Priya to pick up her envelope. I told Priya to turn around. I told Priya to leave my home immediately and never walk in again without knocking. Priya did not back down. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that scraped against the walls. She flipped her hair back her face, twisting into a sneer of pure entitlement. She informed me with a triumphant smirk that I had no right to remove her. She said Derek had already promised her the house. He had told her our home would be entirely at her disposal for the holiday week, cleared of us entirely, if that's what it took. Her eyes moved around our living room, sweeping over the crown molding and the antique furniture we had spent decades building. "This old place is the least you can offer," she said, her voice thick with venomous privilege. "My parents are used to a certain standard. Derek knows this is the only way we can host them without being humiliated. You should be grateful we're willing to use it." She spun on her heel, the aggressive clicking of her shoes receding down the hallway. The front door slammed, rattling the picture frames on the walls. I stood in the center of my home, the echo still ringing in my ears. I looked down at the thick embossed envelope resting on the coffee table like something coiled and dangerous. I did not touch it yet. I looked at Elaine. She was trembling, hands clasped tight in her lap, eyes wide with the full weight of what our son had allowed his wife to become. I walked to my wife. I knelt beside her chair, setting aside the ache in my own aging joints. I took her trembling hands between mine. In a voice that left no room for argument, I made her 3 promises: she would not cook a single meal, she would not scrub a single floor, and the illusion Derek and Priya had so carefully constructed was about to come down on top of them. I walked back down the hallway, the sharp, aggressive strike of my daughter-in-law's designer heels still ringing through the silence of my own home. The air felt thick, poisoned by the sheer audacity of what had just taken place. I moved into the kitchen. The afternoon light pushed through the blinds at a low angle, throwing long, hard shadows across the floorboards. Elaine sat on the wooden stool at the center island, not sobbing, not wailing. She was weeping with the silent, suffocating grief of a mother who had just understood that every sacrifice she had ever made meant absolutely nothing. Her hands, slightly curled from decades of caring for our family, were pressed flat against her face. Her posture had completely folded in on itself. Just 10 months earlier, I had sat beside her as the anesthesia lifted after a grueling double knee replacement. I had watched her bite down on the pain as she taught herself to walk again, one agonizing step at a time, driven by a single goal to be strong enough to play with the grandchildren we had naively believed our son, Derek, and his wife Priya would one day give us. Now that same resilient woman sat trembling over a sheet of thick cream-colored paper. I moved to her side, laid a steady hand on her shaking shoulder, and looked down at the documents Priya had dropped onto our coffee table, the ones Elaine had carried into the kitchen as though they were a death sentence. This was no simple request. It was a manifesto of cruelty. The pages were heavy embossed, printed in a sharp and elegant font that seemed to mock the vulgarity of the words it carried. It was a Thanksgiving menu, but nothing like the warm, comforting list of family recipes Elaine had spent 40 years of marriage perfecting. This was an 18-dish culinary marathon, suited to a luxury hotel, not a suburban kitchen outside Atlanta. My eyes moved across the demands. A heritage breed turkey to be basted with a specific citrus and sage glaze every 20 minutes. Saffron-infused lobster bisque. Hand-seared foie gras with fig compote. Artisanal brioche baked entirely from scratch. And at the bottom, a strict minute-by-minute schedule detailing exactly when each elaborate dish was to be presented in the formal dining room. A healthy professional chef with a full team would have struggled with this alone, let alone a 64-year-old woman with artificial joints who was medically required to stay off her feet. But the sheer volume of the labor was not the real poison. The true poison had been injected into the final paragraph. I read the words, and the blood in my veins went cold. Priya had written explicit instructions for how the evening was to unfold. She demanded that our finest antique china, the delicate floral set Elaine had inherited from her own mother, be polished and laid out for her wealthy parents. And then came the closing directive. Priya had instructed Elaine to remain entirely out of sight in the kitchen once the guests arrived. She could pass the serving platters through the swinging door to Derek, but she was under no circumstances to join them at the dining table. The exact phrasing was burned into my retinas. She claimed that older people ruined the aesthetic of a modern upscale holiday gathering. She wrote that my wife, the woman who had welcomed Priya into our family with open arms, who had knitted blankets for her, who had cooked for her more times than anyone could count, would simply disrupt the sophisticated atmosphere her parents expected. It was a calculated, deliberate erasure of a human being. I looked from the cold printed page to Elaine's tear-streaked face. For 3 decades, this kitchen had been the warm, beating heart of our family holidays. I could still picture Derek as a small boy, perched on that very same wooden stool legs, dangling, begging his mother for a taste of her famous pecan pie before the guests arrived. Elaine had always given in, smiling, brushing white flour from her apron, pouring everything she had into the food she made for our son. She had built something magical in this room, and the boy she had nurtured and protected had stood aside while his wife reduced her to an unseen, unpaid servant in her own home. He had authorized this humiliation. He had handed them the knife himself. I did not yell. I did not curse. Anger is a wildly unpredictable force. It makes you reckless. It makes you loud. Over 40 years as a forensic auditor tracing hidden offshore accounts, dismantling the elaborate financial lies of corrupt executives, I had learned that the most destructive thing on earth is not unbridled rage. It is absolute quiet clarity. When a fraudster realizes you have found their hidden ledger, it is not your raised voice that breaks them. It is the silent, undeniable weight of the evidence closing in. I looked at the 18-dish menu. This was their ledger. This was the proof of their moral bankruptcy written in embossed ink. I reached out and gently slid the thick pages from beneath Elaine's trembling hands. She looked up at me, eyes red and wide, with a heartbreaking confusion. She whispered that she didn't know how she could possibly stand at the stove for 3 straight days. She wondered aloud whether she should order a tall stool to sit on, while she cooked, still desperately searching for a way to comply with an impossible, degrading command just to keep the peace. She was still trying to be a good mother to a son who had already discarded her humanity. I hushed her gently. I pressed my lips to the top of her head. I told her in a voice stripped of all uncertainty that she would not be cooking a single dish. I held the pages in my right hand. They felt dense, weighed down by the arrogance of the woman who had printed them, and the complicity of the son who had allowed it. I turned from the kitchen island and walked slowly toward the living room. My footsteps were even on the hardwood. Every sound in the house felt amplified in the ringing silence, the low hum of the refrigerator, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stopped in front of the large brick fireplace anchoring the far wall. It was cold and swept clean, waiting for the hard winter months ahead. I picked up a slim brass lighter from the wooden mantel. I did not tear the paper. I did not crumple it in a burst of rage. I held the cream-colored manifesto steady over the iron grate and struck the flame. The sharp, brief sting of butane cut through the still air. I touched the small orange flame to the corner of the embossed pages. The fire caught immediately. It gnawed through the heavy stock, turning Priya's elegant, commanding font into curling black ash. I watched the flames consume the saffron-infused lobster bisque. I watched them devour the hand-seared foie gras. I watched the fire work eagerly through the paragraph that had dared to declare that my wife was too old, too unsophisticated, and too unwelcome to sit at her own dining table. I held the paper completely still until the heat reached my fingertips. Then I let the glowing remains fall softly onto the cold stone hearth and stood in the deep quiet of my living room as the last red embers faded to gray dust. Something permanent settled over me in that moment, a massive, irreversible shift. The forgiving father, who had looked past his son's growing selfishness, who had made endless excuses for Derek's reckless spending and emotional distance, burned away with those pages. In his place stood the auditor, the man who deals exclusively in facts, in consequences, and in absolute ruin. Derek and Priya wanted our home to project wealth. They wanted our resources to bankroll their lifestyle. They wanted the fruits of our lifelong labor while scrubbing our very existence from the picture. They believed they held all the power because they knew we loved them. They had mistaken parental love for a weakness they could exploit without limit. They were about to receive a very hard, devastating lesson about leverage. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to the dying embers. There would be no screaming, no dramatic confrontations, no tearful pleas for basic respect. Arguments imply a negotiation, and there was nothing left to negotiate. There would only be the swift, silent, and permanent execution of the consequences. The illusion of their control was finished, and the demolition of their false reality was about to begin. The drive downtown was a blur of gray pavement and glaring brake lights. I didn't touch the radio. I didn't roll down the windows. I sat in the complete quiet of my car, letting the rhythm of the road fall in line with the cold, steady beat of my heart. For decades, I had navigated the treacherous currents of corporate audits, facing down men who had stolen millions, men who smiled to your face while shredding documents at their backs. I knew the exact posture of greed. I knew the precise scent of a lie. What I had never been prepared for was finding that same posture and that same scent in the boy I had raised. I parked in the underground garage of the towering glass building where my son worked. The elevator ride to the 38th floor was silent. When the silver doors opened, I stepped onto the plush carpet of his firm. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced, polished smile, rose from her chair and asked whether I had an appointment. I did not slow down. I did not look at her. I simply moved past her desk, ignoring her escalating calls for me to stop. I knew precisely where Derek's office was. I had paid for the tailored suit he wore on his first day inside this building. I had celebrated the promotion that placed him in that corner office. I moved down the long corridor, my footsteps muffled my purpose absolute. I pushed open the heavy glass door without knocking. Derek sat behind an immaculate mahogany desk, eyes fixed on a dual-monitor setup. He wore a crisp white shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm, a silver chronograph gleaming on his wrist. He looked up, his brow creasing with instant irritation rather than surprise. He did not greet me. He did not ask how his mother was feeling. He simply exhaled, sinking back into his expensive leather chair, asking what I was doing, interrupting his workday. I walked straight to his desk. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the charred, brittle remains of Priya's 18-dish menu. I set it down directly in the center of his pristine workspace. The burnt edges crumbled on impact, scattering fine black ash across his perfectly ordered documents. I asked for a justification. My voice stayed completely level, no shouting, no trace of the fatherly warmth he had grown accustomed to exploiting. I asked him to explain why his mother, a woman who had spent the last 10 months grinding through agonizing physical therapy just to walk down a hallway, had been commanded to stand over a stove for 3 days to prepare a feast for his in-laws. I asked him to explain why the woman who gave him life had been explicitly ordered to remain hidden in the kitchen like an unwanted stray dog so she would not ruin the aesthetic of his holiday dinner. I waited for the shame. I waited for realization to move across his face. I waited for my son to apologize, to claim he had never seen the letter, to swear he would make it right. Derek did not flinch. He did not brush the ash from his desk. He looked at the burnt paper, then lifted his eyes to mine, entirely hollow. There was no guilt in that gaze. There was only naked, unvarnished disdain. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and spoke to me as though I were a slow, difficult child. He told me I was being overly dramatic. He told me I was wrecking a pivotal moment in his life over a few hours of cooking. He explained with a chilling calm that Priya's parents were high net worth investors. He laid out how they controlled the keys to his next major promotion, how their social circle was the precise network he needed to penetrate to secure his future at the firm. He framed the Thanksgiving dinner not as a family gathering, but as a strategic business acquisition. He looked me dead in the eye and said that his mother's discomfort was a minimal sacrifice to secure his career. A minimal sacrifice. Those words hung in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of that office. He had reduced his mother's physical agony and emotional humiliation to a line item, a small fee required to purchase the approval of his arrogant in-laws. He did not stop there. Derek rose from his chair, pacing behind the desk, fully surrendering to his own warped logic. He complained about the burden of aging parents. He complained that we were not wealthy enough to impress Priya's family, that our place outside Atlanta was barely adequate for hosting, and that Elaine's presence would only spotlight how ordinary and unremarkable our lives were. He declared that we owed him this. He declared that after everything he had to contend with, the very least we could do was stay out of the way and make him look good. He told me to go home, apologize to Priya for burning her instructions, and make certain Elaine followed the schedule to the letter. I stood completely still. I did not raise a hand. I did not raise my voice. I studied the man pacing in front of me and searched his face for the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest. I searched for the teenager who had wept when his childhood dog died. I searched for the young man who had once promised he would always take care of his mother. The boy was gone, entirely, irreversibly gone. What stood in his place was a parasite dressed in a tailored suit, a man who regarded his own family as raw materials, resources to be consumed and discarded in service of his personal advancement. He had not merely allowed his wife to disrespect us. He had engineered it. He believed his ambition gave him the right to strip us of our dignity. He believed that because I had always provided, I would go on absorbing this abuse the way I had absorbed his financial recklessness for years. Derek stopped pacing. He looked at me expecting a fight. He was prepared to debate. He was ready to counter my outrage with more cold, calculated rationalizations. But an argument requires the belief that the other person is still reachable by reason. An argument is a plea for understanding. I had no desire whatsoever to be understood by the stranger standing before me. I had seen the absolute bottom of his soul, and there was nothing there worth salvaging. I did not say a word. I did not ask him to reconsider. I did not threaten him. I simply looked at the black ash scattered across his desk. Then I held his gaze one final time. I turned my back on him. I crossed the plush carpet, pushed through the heavy glass door, and walked out of his office. I heard him call after me, his voice edged with sudden confusion, but I did not stop. I moved past the receptionist, stepped into the elevator, and dropped back down to the parking garage. The silence that enclosed me was absolute. It was the silence of a man who has finished gathering his evidence and is ready to hand down the verdict. My son wanted to treat his family like a business transaction. He was about to discover exactly what happens when the funding is permanently cut. The drive home was an exercise in mechanical focus. I did not turn on the radio. I did not roll down the windows to let in the cold autumn air. My hands stayed positioned on the leather steering wheel, my posture rigid, my breathing measured and slow. For 4 decades, I had moved through the labyrinthine, deceptive world of corporate audits. I had spent my entire professional life seated across polished tables from men who smiled warmly, while quietly destroying the livelihoods of others. I knew the precise anatomy of greed. I knew the distinct, undeniable scent of a lie. What I had never anticipated, what I had never prepared myself to face, was finding that exact anatomy and that exact scent, living entirely within the boy I had raised. The city skyline receded in the rearview mirror, giving way to the quiet, manicured lawns of my neighborhood. The contrast between the raw ambition of Derek's office and the stillness of my own street was jarring. I pulled into the driveway, shifted into park, and cut the engine. The silence of the car settled around me, heavy and complete. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sorrow. I felt only the cold, unyielding mechanics of a necessary execution. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was painfully quiet. I climbed the carpeted stairs softly and looked in through the master bedroom doorway. Elaine was asleep, stretched out above the covers, her breathing shallow, her face tight even in rest. The mere anticipation of the holiday, the sheer dread of failing to meet the impossible demands placed on her surgically rebuilt knees, had drained whatever physical reserves she had left. I watched her chest rise and fall. I looked at the medical brace resting on the bedside table. I made a silent promise to the stillness of that room. Then I pulled the door gently closed and went back downstairs. I walked directly into the formal dining room. The space was vast, anchored by a massive custom-built mahogany dining table, an imposing piece of craftsmanship that seated 12 comfortably, its intricate claw feet and high-gloss surface catching the light from the crystal chandelier above like a dark, still mirror. Conrad remembered the day he and Elaine had bought it 20 years prior. They had put money aside for months, picturing decades of warm family gatherings, grandchildren running laps around its edges, holiday feasts heavy with gratitude. Now the table had been gutted of that original meaning entirely. It was no longer a symbol of anything warm. It had been turned into a weapon. Priya had claimed this table as her personal stage. She had built her entire Thanksgiving around this specific piece of furniture. She had pictured her wealthy parents seated at the head of this majestic mahogany slab, marveling at the crystal and silverware, while the woman who actually owned the house stayed banished to the kitchen, tucked out of sight like an embarrassing unpaid servant. The table was the literal platform for his wife's planned humiliation. And so, the table could no longer remain inside these walls. Conrad pulled his phone from his coat pocket. He did not look for a charity donation center. He did not search for an ordinary moving company. He needed action that was immediate and irreversible. He searched instead for a high-end estate liquidator capable of rapid extraction. He dialed a local number. A man named Neville picked up on the third ring. Conrad spoke in a flat, transactional tone. He described the 12-seat mahogany antique. He described the matching chairs, the pristine condition of the wood, the flawless upholstery. Neville hesitated, citing a fully booked schedule and no available appraisal window. Conrad cut right past the hesitation. He offered the entire set for a fraction of its market value with one non-negotiable condition: every piece had to be off the property within 2 hours. Neville paused, quickly ran the numbers on the profit margin, and agreed without another word of protest. The deal was done, cold and efficient. Conrad stood in the doorway of the dining room and waited. He did not pace. He did not second-guess his decision. He simply looked at the furniture not as wood and fabric, but as a fraudulent asset earmarked for immediate seizure. Exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes later, the low rumble of a heavy diesel engine broke the quiet of the suburban street outside Atlanta. A large white box truck sat idling in the driveway. 3 men in gray uniforms climbed out carrying thick quilted moving blankets, heavy canvas straps, and power drills. Conrad opened the front door before they had a chance to ring the bell. He led them straight to the dining room. He stood in the corner, arms folded across his chest, and watched the work begin. The process was methodical and loud. The lead mover flipped the heavy dining chairs upside down, stacking them without ceremony. The other 2 men dropped beneath the massive mahogany table. The sharp mechanical whine of power drills filled the space. The sound ricocheted off the walls, harsh and abrasive, swallowing the usual quiet of the house whole. Heavy steel bolts clattered down onto the hardwood floor. Thick metal brackets were tossed into a plastic bucket without care. The men communicated in short-clipped grunts as they hoisted the enormous tabletop free of its ornate pedestals. Conrad watched them swaddle the dark, polished wood in thick gray blankets. He watched them cinch the canvas straps tight, each binding locked with a loud metallic snap. Moving the piece demanded real effort. The men dug in their boots, sliding against the floorboards as they steered the massive slab out of the room, through the hallway, and toward the open front door. Conrad watched the chairs disappear two by two. He watched the intricately carved pedestals follow. He watched the men haul the very foundation of Priya's arrogant holiday plan out into the cold afternoon air. With every piece that crossed the threshold, Conrad felt a corresponding weight lift from the bones of the house. The physical dismantling of the dining room mirrored precisely perfectly the systematic dismantling of his relationship with his son. Derek had demanded a stage to project a false reality. Conrad was physically tearing the floorboards out from under it. The movers came back for the final pieces. They swept the floor for stray bolts and handed Conrad a digital tablet to complete the transfer of ownership. Conrad signed his name in one swift, fluid motion. The transaction was finished. The men walked out. They hauled the heavy metal door of the box truck down with a crash that echoed up the street. The diesel engine roared back to life, and the truck rolled slowly forward, turned the corner, and disappeared. Conrad shut the front door. He turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock clicked home, sealing the house. He walked slowly back down the hallway and stopped at the threshold of the dining room. The change was absolute. The space was no longer a dining room. It was a cavern. A vast echoing rectangle of bare hardwood and empty walls. The floor held faint circular impressions in the polish where the heavy claw feet had sat for 20 years. Temporary ghosts of a past that no longer had any claim on things. The chandelier hung overhead, illuminating nothing at all. Conrad took a step into the center of the room. His shoe struck the hardwood. The sound bounced off the drywall, sharp and clean. He took another step, another echo. The room felt immense, stripped of its purpose, stripped of its history, and completely rid of Priya's toxic ambition. Conrad drew in a breath. The scent of lemon polish and aged wood was gone, replaced by the neutral, sterile air of an emptied space. He spoke a single word aloud, testing the acoustics of his newly barren territory. The sound came back to him hollow and clear. It was a beautiful, devastating emptiness, a perfectly cleansed slate. The first pillar of Derek and Priya's false reality had been erased. There was no table for her parents to sit at. There was no stage for her to command. There was only a void and the quiet, relentless momentum of an auditor working his way down a list. The mahogany doors of Clifton Yarrow's law firm in Buckhead, Atlanta, were heavy built to shut out the frantic noise of the city below. Conrad pushed through them with a steady, measured stride. The receptionist offered a polite greeting. Conrad gave a brief nod and walked straight down the corridor to the corner office. He had known Clifton for 20 years. They had faced each other across countless federal depositions, picking apart the financial wreckage left by corrupt executives. Clifton was a man who dealt only in hard facts, and today Conrad was bringing him a ledger of profound personal betrayal. Clifton looked up from his polished glass desk as Conrad entered. The lawyer immediately read the shift in his old friend. There was no easy warmth here today. Conrad settled into the leather chair opposite the desk. He unclasped his briefcase and drew out a thick stack of printed bank statements. He set them on the glass surface. The papers slid forward with a soft, final sound. Conrad told Clifton to look at the highlighted transactions. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and bent over the documents. The silence in the room stretched, broken only by the crisp rustle of turning pages. Clifton traced the highlighted lines with his pen. He saw the systematic withdrawals from the Joint Emergency Fund. He saw the routing numbers leading directly to a luxury European auto dealership in Buckhead, Atlanta. He raised his eyes to Conrad, his professional detachment slipping just enough to let genuine shock through. Clifton asked whether Derek had sought permission to borrow against Elaine's medical fund. Conrad replied that his son had not asked, nor had he borrowed. He had simply taken it certain that his mother's pain was less important than his wife's appetite for a status symbol. Clifton leaned back in his chair. He asked Conrad precisely how he wanted to handle it. Conrad did not hesitate. He did not ask for a mediation strategy or a warning letter. He asked for complete and immediate financial severance. The first strike was the vehicle. 2 years earlier, Conrad had co-signed the lease on Derek's luxury SUV, a favor extended out of blind parental trust, on the assumption that his son was responsible enough to manage the monthly payments. Conrad told Clifton that the vehicle was his daughter-in-law's single greatest pride, the very machine she paraded in front of her wealthy parents. He requested the immediate withdrawal of his guarantor status. Clifton warned him that doing so without notice would trigger an automatic default on the lease. The dealership would flag the account before the end of the business day and issue an immediate repossession order. Derek would have no legal ground to keep the car. Conrad nodded. He said that a man who steals from his mother to lease a car deserves to walk to work. Clifton printed the withdrawal form. Conrad lifted the heavy silver pen from the desk. He signed his name in one smooth, unforgiving stroke. The first cord was cut. The second strike required fortifying what remained. The joint emergency account had been a fatal vulnerability. Conrad instructed Clifton to drain the compromised account immediately and transfer every remaining cent into a newly established impenetrable offshore trust. This trust would be governed under ironclad, non-negotiable conditions. Conrad and Elaine alone would hold access to it. It was a financial stronghold built specifically to safeguard Elaine's future surgeries and high-level physical therapy. Clifton Yarrow drafted the transfer authorization and made the stakes plain. Once the funds moved, Derek would find himself locked out entirely. He would open his banking app to nothing but a blank screen. The safety net he had been dipping into like a personal slush fund would evaporate without a trace. Conrad reviewed every condition of the trust with the exacting care of a seasoned auditor, reading each line before adding his name to the second document. The ink set fast on the heavy paper. The second cord was severed. The final blow landed hardest of all. The wholesale demolition of the future Derek had always assumed was his by right. Conrad asked Clifton to bring up his last will and testament. For years, the document had been straightforward and conventional. When Conrad and Elaine passed the full weight of their estate, the paid-off house outside Atlanta, the investment portfolios, the retirement accounts would flow directly to their only son. Derek had built his entire smug worldview on that single certainty. No matter how carelessly he spent, no matter how cruelly he treated his parents, the money would eventually land in his hands. He had never seen his parents as people, only as a waiting room for his inheritance. Conrad stared at the digital version of the will displayed on Clifton's monitor. He saw Derek's name sitting there, stark and formal on the screen. A sudden tide of memory moved through him. He thought of teaching Derek to ride a bicycle in that same driveway he was now preparing to sign away. He thought of the tuition checks that had launched his son into the corporate world. He remembered the swell of pride on graduation day, but those memories belonged to someone who no longer existed. The boy in them had been replaced by a man who let his wife command a woman with a shattered knee to stand over a hot stove for 3 days while he paraded around on stolen money. Conrad turned to Clifton and told his lawyer to remove Derek's name from the document entirely. He wanted Derek cut from the estate, no provision, no fallback, nothing. Clifton paused, his hand stilled over the keyboard. He gently reminded Conrad that disinheriting an only child was a permanent and devastating step, and asked whether a nominal sum should remain to reduce the risk of a court challenge. Conrad didn't waver. He said Derek was to receive nothing, not $1, not one piece of furniture, not a single keepsake from the house. Conrad then named the new beneficiary. The full estate would be liquidated upon their deaths, and the proceeds directed to a national foundation that shielded elderly people from financial abuse at the hands of family members. The irony was precise and fully intended. Every dollar Derek had spent his life waiting to inherit would now be weaponized against the exact kind of predator he had become. Clifton updated the document. The printer hummed and churned out the thick, revised pages. He set them on the glass desk edges squared and placed the silver pen back into Conrad's hand. This was the point of no return. Once that pen touched paper, the family's financial legacy would be permanently redrawn. Conrad held the pen. He did not feel the collapse of grief he had braced for. No impulse surfaced to pick up his phone and plead with his son to be a different man. What he felt instead was the clean, cool equilibrium of a perfectly balanced ledger. Derek had chosen superficial status over his own mother's health and dignity. Conrad was simply recording the receipt for that transaction. He pressed the pen to the page. The signature came out firm, dark, and absolute. He signed the first page. He turned to the next and signed again. He reached the final page and set his name on the dotted line. 3 deliberate strokes. In under 10 minutes, Conrad had systematically dismantled every pillar of his son's financial future. Clifton collected the documents and brought down his official notary stamp. The sound of it hitting the paper rang through the quiet office like the drop of a judge's gavel. Clifton looked at Conrad, a quiet respect settling into his expression. He told his old friend the paperwork would be filed with the courts before the day was out. The auto lease cancellation would go to the Buckhead Atlanta dealership immediately. The bank transfer was already in motion. Conrad rose from the leather chair, buttoned his jacket, and did not look back at the desk. He thanked Clifton for the efficiency. He lifted his empty briefcase, the bank statements, and the old life left behind on the glass surface. He walked out of the office down the carpeted hallway and stepped into the elevator. As it descended toward the ground floor, a profound lightness expanded in his chest. The weight of longing for a son who no longer existed had lifted. He had spent a career digging into corporations, exposing the rot hiding beneath polished surfaces. Now he had turned that same scrutiny on his own family. He had found the rot. He had cut it out. He stepped through the building's exit and into the sharp city air. He walked to his car ready to go home, pack his bags, and take his wife to the water. The trap was set. The fuse was lit. All that was left was for Derek and Priya to strike the match. Wednesday morning arrived wrapped in a biting frost that clung to the windows of their Atlanta area home like a film of pale ice. The house was entirely silent. There was none of the frantic, pressurized energy that normally preceded a major holiday. In years past, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving was a full-scale battlefield. Elaine would have been on her feet since 4 in the morning, flour on her hands, the ovens blazing her face, carrying the quiet desperation of a woman straining to satisfy a son who never once said thank you. For decades, she had worn down her own comfort to sustain the perfect illusion of a happy family. Today the kitchen was dark. The ovens sat cold. The silence was a definitive answer to a question Derek and Priya had never thought to ask. Conrad stood in the middle of their master bedroom and reached up to pull 2 worn leather suitcases from the top shelf of the closet. The handles were soft with age, a quiet record of the years he had spent crossing the country, dismantling the fraudulent financial empires of corrupt men. He set the suitcases open on the bed. The zippers glided with a smooth, metallic hiss. He moved with cold, methodical precision, pulling resort-wear linen shirts and Elaine's favorite colorful sundresses from the wooden drawers. He packed with purpose. No heavy wool sweaters, no formal dining attire. He was packing for a complete atmospheric extraction, a life that no longer bent itself to the demands of an arrogant child. Elaine stirred beneath the heavy duvet. She pushed herself upright slowly, eyes adjusting to the gray light pressing through the curtains. She saw the open suitcases on the mattress, then looked toward the empty hallway that led to the dark kitchen. A flash of conditioned panic moved across her face. Her eyes went to the digital clock on the nightstand, her mind automatically calculating how many hours remained to brine a heritage turkey. She didn't have to bake artisanal brioche she had no ingredients for. Out of pure terrified habit, she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and reached for her rigid knee braces. Conrad stopped her. He came around to her side of the bed, gently but firmly moved the braces beyond her reach, and knelt until he was level with her eyes. He looked at her and told her that her days of standing over a hot stove for people who openly despised her were over, done, permanently. He told her to put on her most comfortable traveling clothes. Elaine looked at the steady, unyielding resolve written into every line of her husband's face. She didn't argue. She didn't ask about the 18-dish menu that had been haunting her all night. She simply nodded, placing her complete trust in the man who had stood beside her for 4 decades. Conrad left her to dress and walked down the hall to his study. The room held the morning's chill. He opened his laptop, the bright screen slicing through the shadows. He navigated to a secure travel portal. He was not searching for budget commercial airlines. He wasn't hunting for cheap rooms to preserve funds for Derek's next crisis. He drew on the capital he'd successfully secured the day before the substantial assets he had legally wrested from his son's reaching hands. He booked 2 first-class tickets to Amelia Island, Florida. He chose a secluded luxury oceanfront resort, far removed from the mainland's noise and concrete. When the booking screen asked him to select a return date, he skipped past it entirely. One-way tickets. The sheer finality of that transaction settled over him like something earned. This wasn't a vacation they were setting out on. It was a geographical and emotional line, drawn in permanent ink. It was the physical embodiment of the impenetrable wall he had just built between their peace and Derek's greed. The confirmation email landed with a soft ping. The flight was set to depart in exactly 3 hours. Conrad closed the laptop. He pulled open the top drawer of his mahogany desk and took out a single sheet of heavy unlined white stationery and a black ink fountain pen. He walked out of the study and into the bare dining room. The empty space felt enormous, a cavernous void where the imposing mahogany table had once ruled the room. The polished floorboards still held the faint circular impressions left by the heavy claw feet, ghostly reminders of a domestic life that had been forcibly put to rest. Conrad lowered himself to one knee on the bare hardwood. His joints cracked in the stillness, a pointed reminder of the years stacked behind him, but he pushed the stiffness aside. He pressed the heavy stationery flat against the cold polished wood and uncapped the pen. He did not write a long emotional letter. He didn't catalog Derek's failures across a lifetime or lay out Priya's cruelties in detail. He didn't ask for an apology or bother explaining himself. Explanations belonged to negotiations, and Conrad was done negotiating with terrorists. He wrote one concise sentence. The ink ran dark and absolute across the clean white page. He set the note precisely in the center of the room, right where the head of the table had stood, right where Priya had planned to sit and preside over his wife's humiliation. The white paper stood out like a signal flare against the dark wood, a silent, devastating landmine waiting patiently for someone to step close. Conrad got to his feet and walked back to the foyer just as Elaine came down the stairs. She wore a soft, woven sweater and loose, comfortable trousers, her small leather handbag in hand. She paused at the bottom step and looked into the formal dining room. Her eyes widened slightly at the stark, undeniable reality of what was missing. She took in the single white note resting on the floorboards. She didn't ask what it said. She didn't ask where the table had gone. She looked at Conrad. She reached out and took his hand firmly in hers. Her fingers were warm, tethering him to the only thing left in this house that genuinely mattered. Conrad picked up the two heavy leather suitcases and opened the front door. The sharp morning frost met their faces, crisp and brutally waking. They stepped out into the driveway, leaving the warmth of the house at their backs. Conrad loaded the luggage into the trunk of their sedan, then opened the passenger door for Elaine, waiting until she was settled comfortably before closing it with a solid thud. He came around to the driver's side and slid behind the wheel. He pressed the ignition. The engine came to life with a steady, reliable hum that broke the silence of the sleeping neighborhood. He hit the button on the visor to draw the garage door down. He did not look back at the sprawling Atlanta residence outside the city that had consumed so much of their years. He shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb. They wound through the affluent streets of their neighborhood as the city stirred slowly around them. The yellow streetlights blinked off one by one, surrendering to the pale, creeping dawn. Frost-covered lawns drifted past the windows, pristine and untouched. Delivery trucks had begun their morning rounds, dropping off supplies for the enormous fraught holiday feasts being frantically assembled in every other house on the block. Inside the car, the heater pushed warm, steady air over them both. Elaine rested her head against the leather seat and watched the bare winter trees blur past the glass. Conrad kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. The highway opened up before them, cutting through the waking city like a gray ribbon. He drove with the calm, unwavering focus of a man who had just completed a careful extraction. For years he had operated under the delusion that giving more would eventually earn him respect. He had told himself that absorbing insults and writing checks would hold the family together. He understood now with crystalline clarity that compliance had only ever bred contempt. Derek and Priya had fatally misread his silence as weakness. They had mistaken Elaine's quiet dignity for permanent servitude. The international airport rose ahead of them. The vast glass and steel terminals climbed against the brightening sky. Conrad navigated the tangle of departing flight lanes and pulled smoothly up to the first-class drop-off zone. A uniformed porter appeared at once, lifting their heavy leather bags from the trunk onto a brass cart. Conrad pressed a generous cash tip into the man's hand and offered his arm to Elaine. They passed through the sliding automatic doors into the surging warmth of the terminal. The building was a full hive of holiday chaos. Stressed families hauled oversized luggage while children's cries cut through the constant drone of the public address system. Frantic travelers sparred with ticket agents at every counter. But Conrad and Elaine moved through that panicked, churning crowd inside a serene and untouchable bubble. They bypassed the long, winding security queues, stepping through the priority screening lane without breaking stride. They made their way to the private luxury airline lounge, hushed, heavily insulated, scented with fresh ground coffee and polished leather. Conrad found a secluded corner table beside the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the busy tarmac. He ordered them both a warm breakfast from the attendant. Elaine took a slow sip of her chamomile tea. She gazed out at the large commercial jets pulling up to the gates, prepared to carry thousands of anxious passengers toward their obligatory, stress-laden family gatherings. Then she turned and looked at Conrad. The tight, worn tension that had lived at the corners of her eyes for months was simply gone. She did not look like a woman bracing for a relentless cooking schedule. She looked like a woman who had just been handed back ownership of her own life. Conrad drank his black coffee. He watched a silver plane taxi along the runway, its engines building to a roar as it lined up for takeoff. He knew precisely what was unfolding back at the house. The silent countdown had already started. In roughly 24 hours, Priya would push open that front door, expecting the rich aroma of roasting turkey and a perfectly staged dining room, primed to impress her parents. Derek would follow, expecting to assert his dominance over his aging parents without a moment's hesitation. Conrad took another slow, deliberate sip. The trap was perfectly laid. The financial safety nets had been reduced to ash. The stage had been physically dismantled and hauled away. All that remained was to board a plane lift off over the Atlantic and wait for the spectacular explosion. The landing gear of the first-class cabin retracted with a soft, mechanical thrum as the aircraft banked out over the water. Below the clouds, the ocean stretched out like an endless sheet of hammered silver. When the plane finally touched down, the golden hour light of Amelia Island, Florida, washed across the runway. The sky ran deep bruised purples into brilliant burning golds. Conrad watched Elaine as she pressed close to the window. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, the perpetual shadow of anxiety that had lived behind her eyes began slowly to lift. She breathed in the warm, humid air as they stepped off the plane, and a small, genuine smile found her lips. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. A private driver met them at the gate and eased them into a climate-controlled vehicle. The drive to the coast was a blur of lush green palms and vivid tropical blooms. The resort was a sanctuary of wood and stone, perched above the crashing surf. They were checked into an oceanfront suite that overlooked the vast expanse of the Atlantic. The air inside the room carried the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine. Conrad crossed to the floor-to-ceiling glass doors and slid them open. The sound of the waves rolled in, sweeping away the sterile hum of the city life they had left behind. Elaine stepped out onto the balcony and drew a long, steady breath. She looked toward the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to sink beneath the water. What I'm about to share with you is the moment everything shifted, not just for me, but for the kind of man I had decided I was still capable of being. Before I get there, I want to ask you this. If someone you had given everything to had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait until every piece was in place? Conrad took her hand as he joined her at the railing. Her skin was warm to the touch, and for the first time in years, her pulse felt slow and steady beneath his fingers. There was no schedule pressing down on them here, no turkey to brine, no artisanal brioche to bake. There was only the rhythm of the ocean and the quiet, crushing weight of the new life they had chosen. He stepped back inside and pulled his phone from his pocket. He stood there staring at the screen for a long moment. He navigated into the settings and manually cut off the cellular network altogether. He wanted no stray signal from the mainland to find its way into this place. He connected the device instead to the hotel's encrypted Wi-Fi. That single thread was the only link he kept to the world he had just taken apart. He opened the security camera application and pulled up the live feed of their suburban home outside Atlanta. The screen came alive, showing him the interior of the house they had walked out of. The living room had the quality of a stage with no performers. The dining room stopped him cold. Where the mahogany table had stood, there was now a wide, hollow void. The space had the feel of a tomb built to hold a life that was already over. Conrad zoomed in on the bare hardwood floor and found the small white note he had placed at the exact center of the room. It waited there in the dimness like a solitary sentinel. He knew his son's routine more intimately than his own. He knew that in exactly 22 hours, Derek and Priya would swing their luxury SUV into the driveway, grocery bags in hand, their expectations fully intact. They would come through the front door with the unshakable confidence of people who had convinced themselves they had broken their parents into perfect submission. They would walk into that dining room, expecting to find every element of their calculated acquisition staged and ready. Conrad watched the feed. He could almost see the bewilderment spreading across their faces the moment they registered that the centerpiece of their entire scheme had disappeared. He could see the note patient and waiting. He could see the whole architecture of their arrogance beginning to crack at its foundation. The property outside Atlanta was primed for a devastating collapse. Every piece of the trap was loaded and locked. Conrad settled onto the edge of the bed and kept his eyes on the feed from thousands of miles away. He finally grasped what peace actually meant. It was the ability to watch your enemies unravel from a position of total safety and complete detachment. He rose and walked back out to the balcony where Elaine was waiting. Stars were beginning to surface over the water. He decided that tonight marked the opening of whatever came next. He pulled a chair alongside hers and watched the darkness settle across the surface of the sea. They did not speak of that place. They did not speak of Derek. They sat together in the quiet dark, letting the sound of the ocean dissolve the wreckage of everything behind them. The trap was set. The clock was running. Conrad closed his eyes and let the waves carry him to sleep, unburdened at last from the weight of his son's failures. The sun over St. Simon's Island, Georgia, beat down on the wide wooden balcony, throwing a brilliant unbroken sheet of gold across the teak floorboards. It was exactly 2:00 in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. There was no frost here, no biting wind against the glass, no cold working its way into the bones. The air hung heavy with the sweet, intoxicating scent of jasmine and the sharp, clean edge of salt off the water. Below our oceanfront suite that overlooked the vast expanse of the Atlantic, the sea came in with a rolling, hypnotic rhythm, a turquoise expanse that seemed to absorb every last shred of anxiety we had carried across the miles. Elaine sat in a cushioned rattan chair, eyes closed, face turned up toward the warmth of the sun. She looked younger than she had in years. The deep lines stress had carved around her mouth, the permanent tension that seized her jaw every holiday season had gone completely. Beside her, the private chef we had engaged for the afternoon worked quietly building a platter of roasted seafood. The warm aroma of garlic melted butter and freshly caught roasted grouper drifted out and mingled with the island breeze. It was a meal that tasted like absolute undeniable liberation. My tablet sat on the small glass table beside a sweating glass of iced tea, its screen dark a silent black mirror, throwing the blue sky back at itself. I had killed every cellular connection the moment we touched down. No frantic calls could reach this place. No furious messages from entitled children could interrupt the steady grounding rhythm of the surf. The only line I kept open to the mainland was a heavily encrypted dedicated connection feeding the security cameras I had installed around the perimeter and throughout the main rooms of our place outside Atlanta. I picked up the device and woke the screen. The application opened instantly, indifferent to the distance between us. The interface laid out a grid of high-definition feeds. The house outside Atlanta was utterly still. The living room sat in the flat gray light of a late autumn afternoon. Dust motes drifted lazily through the cold, motionless air. The kitchen was spotlessly clean, the large ovens dark and silent, the marble counters completely bare of the frantic, exhausting preparation that should have been well underway by now. It was a silent mausoleum, purpose-built to house their shattered expectations. Then a silent notification flared across the top of the screen. Motion detected at the front driveway. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, my breathing falling into a slow, deliberate rhythm. I said nothing to Elaine. She was savoring a piece of roasted fish, fully absorbed in an easy conversation with the chef about local spices and technique. I kept my gaze fixed on the feed. A gleaming black luxury SUV rolled into frame tires, pressing audibly into the paved driveway. It was the exact vehicle I had leased for my son, the very car whose financial guarantee I had legally severed just days earlier. The engine cut off. Both doors opened at once. Derek stepped out first, tailored wool overcoat hair, immaculate, projecting the polished image of a prosperous young executive with complete command of his world. Priya came out from the passenger side, wrapped in expensive cashmere, her posture radiating a studied, manufactured grace. From the rear doors, her parents descended onto the concrete driveway. They were exactly what I had expected. Wealthy, appraising people swathed in designer coats arriving to be served, expecting to walk into a residence that confirmed their daughter's ascent and mirrored their own sense of superiority. Priya led them up the front walk. She gestured toward the landscaping, clearly presenting the manicured lawn and trimmed hedges which I had paid for over many years as evidence of her own stewardship. She pointed toward the facade, weaving a narrative of ownership and dominance for her attentive parents. Derek walked close at her side, carrying 2 expensive bottles of wine, performing the role of the generous and successful host. They climbed the brick steps to the porch. I switched the feed to the interior foyer camera, pulling the view in tighter. Priya worked her key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the heavy front door open, with a wide theatrical gesture verbally welcoming her parents into territory she believed she had conquered. The camera caught the precise, beautiful moment the illusion began to break. As they crossed the threshold, their bodies braced instinctively for a specific sensory world. They expected the deep enveloping aroma of roasted turkey sage stuffing and a warm butter. They expected the welcoming heat of a dwelling that had been cooking for 2 full days. They expected the sounds of a busy kitchen fine china being set out, the quiet, invisible presence of an aging woman bent entirely to their will. What greeted them instead was the sharp chill of a place where the thermostat had been purposefully turned down to vier graden. They walked into the stale, static air of an abandoned building. The silence was total. It was a dense, suffocating quiet that immediately stripped the smug, performative smiles from their faces. Priya stopped dead in the center of the foyer. Her cashmere coat shifted loose around her shoulders. She looked toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, genuine confusion pulling hard at her brow. She called out Elaine's name. The audio feed caught it clearly. It was not a greeting. It was a sharp, impatient command. She expected my wife to appear from the kitchen, hands drying on an apron, ready to relieve them of their coats and quietly pour their wine. The walls gave nothing back. Her voice hit the cold drywall and dissolved into silence. Derek moved forward at once, his authoritative bearing suddenly gone. He scanned the shadows with the look of a lost, frightened child. He called out for me, yelled my name into the empty rooms, demanding an answer for the unacceptable and terrifying quiet. The building remained perfectly stubbornly mute. Priya's mother, a sharp-featured woman with a severely lifted face, drew her arms tightly across her chest. She wheeled around and asked Priya whether this was some kind of sick joke. She complained loudly and without restraint about the glacial chill of the entryway. The mortification spread visibly across Priya's face, blooming into uneven splotches of red across her cheeks. The carefully maintained fiction she had constructed was coming apart in front of the precise audience she had spent years trying to dazzle. She stormed down the hallway, designer heels cracking against the hardwood like a gavel. She was moving straight for the formal dining room, the grand deliberate stage she had handpicked for her holiday coronation. She intended to parade her parents past the magnificent 12-seat mahogany table as living proof that she had bent her husband's family to her will and extracted a venue worthy of her bloodline. I tapped the screen and shifted the feed to the dining room camera. I watched as Priya rounded the corner and crossed the threshold. She stopped cold, every muscle in her body locked up. The halt was so sudden that Derek walked straight into her from behind. Her parents crowded in on either side, peering past them into the space. The camera caught the full, devastating clarity of that shared realization. The room was not a grand holiday tableau. It was a bare, echoing shell. The massive mahogany table gone, the 12 matching chairs gone, the intricately carved pedestals gone without a trace. The room had been stripped to its bones. The polished hardwood stretched unbroken from wall to wall, marked only by the faint circular impressions where the heavy furniture had once pressed into the floor. The crystal chandeliers still hung overhead, flooding the room with light and illuminating an absolute, inescapable void. Priya's jaw went slack. Her illusion, her wealth, her control, her power over the room dissolved into the cold suburban air outside Atlanta. She turned in frantic circles as though the antique table might somehow emerge from behind the curtains if she looked hard enough. Her father exhaled a low, contemptuous sigh, muttering just loud enough to be heard about a pathetic waste of his time. Priya's mother fixed her daughter with a look of pure, undiluted disdain, asking whether this hollow room was the refined holiday gathering she had been promised. Priya could not produce a single word. She had no contingency for this. She had designed an evening meant to treat my wife like hired help, and instead she was standing in an empty room, exposed as a counterfeit in front of the only people whose esteem she wanted more than air. Derek moved past his paralyzed wife. His gaze swept across the vast emptiness. Then he looked down. Resting precisely at the center of the bare floorboards, exactly where the head of the vanished table had once stood, was the single crisp white note I had left behind. He walked toward it slowly. Each footstep rang out in the hollow space. He crouched, picked up the heavy stationery, and straightened. I studied his face through the high-definition lens. I watched his eyes move across the single sentence I had written with my fountain pen. The color left his face entirely draining away until what remained was pale and sickly gray. The arrogant corporate predator who had sat behind his mahogany desk and informed me that my wife's physical suffering was a minor inconvenience, that man was gone in an instant permanently. His hands started to shake. The white note trembled between his fingers. He read the words a second time, then a third, as if his mind refused to accept the absolute finality of what was written there. He raised his eyes and stared directly into the lens of the security camera mounted in the corner. He knew I was watching. He understood precisely what this meant. In that single shattering second, it became clear to him that the funding was gone for good. The stage was struck. The inheritance had been erased. And the parents he had treated as disposable financial assets were irrevocably out of reach. I had no need to hear whatever came out of his mouth next. I had no interest in witnessing the ugly, inevitable collision between him, his furious wife, and her thoroughly disgusted parents. I had seen everything I came to see. The audit was finished. The fraudulent account was closed. I pressed the power button on the tablet, and the screen went dark. My son's chaotic, poisonous world was severed. I set the device face down on the glass table and looked up. The sky above the Atlantic had deepened into a sweeping canopy of burnt orange and bruised purple. The ocean hammered the shoreline, powerful and entirely indifferent to the petty ambitions of people clawing their way up the corporate ladder back on the mainland. Elaine turned toward me and offered a plate of perfectly roasted grouper, her smile wide and unburdened. I accepted a piece and savored the rich, layered flavors, knowing that the finest feast of my life was the deep, absolute quiet of a clean ledger. The afternoon sun sat low over the Atlantic, drawing long golden shadows across the teak decking of our oceanfront balcony. The air carried the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine, a thick, intoxicating sweetness that felt wholly foreign after decades of November's bitter cold back in the city. Elaine sat across from me at ease. The tight, worried lines that had lived around her eyes for years had softened, entirely smoothed away by the warmth and the profound absence of anyone's expectations. I held a glass of chilled white wine, feeling the condensation bead against my palm. The steady rhythm of the waves below set a slow, calming cadence to the afternoon. Then something cut through the stillness of our retreat. The sharp electronic chirp of my phone pierced the sound of the ocean. I had shut down the main network connections, leaving only the hotel Wi-Fi active for the security cameras, but I had deliberately kept the voice-over internet line open for exactly this moment. I glanced down at the glass table. The device's screen glowed against the shaded surface. The caller ID displayed Derek's name. The letters looked small and powerless, stripped of every ounce of authority they had once carried in our household. Elaine paused her wine glass halfway to her lips. A brief, instinctive shadow of her old anxiety moved across her face. She looked at the phone, then at me. I gave her a slow, steady nod. I reached over and accepted the call. I did not bring the phone to my ear. I set it flat at the center of the glass table and switched it to speaker. I said nothing in greeting. I simply let the connection sit open, letting the ambient sound of the St. Simon's Island breeze drift into the microphone. The response from the other end was immediate and unhinged. No hesitation, no formal hello, no attempt to preserve the pretense of a family calling to wish us well on the holiday. A shrill, piercing sound burst from the small speaker. It was Priya. Her voice was unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant, counterfeit, sophisticated register she had wielded as a weapon for the past 2 years had completely disintegrated. What replaced it was the raw, unfiltered shrieking of someone whose carefully engineered reality had just been reduced to rubble. She demanded to know where the table was. She repeated the question in a rising, frantic cadence, her words colliding with each other in a chaotic torrent. She screamed that the dining room was bare. She screamed that there was no centerpiece, no fine china, no silver laid and polished for her guests. She demanded to know where the food was. She narrated her desperate search through the dark, cold kitchen, her voice cracking as she described pulling open an empty refrigerator and staring into unlit cold ovens. Then the panic curdled into venom. She demanded to know where the invisible mother-in-law had gone. Those were her exact words. She asked where the servant was hiding, insisting that Elaine was supposed to be there, stationed out of sight, ready to produce the feast that would secure Derek's promotion. Priya screamed that her parents were standing in the hallway freezing, and that the entire presentation of her sophisticated Thanksgiving had been obliterated. I listened to the whole tirade with the detached calm of an auditor working through a deeply flawed ledger. Her hysteria was the auditory evidence of her moral bankruptcy. She expressed no concern that her elderly in-laws had vanished without a word. She did not ask whether there had been a medical emergency or some sudden crisis. Her only obsession was the ruin of her performance and the absence of the free labor she believed was owed to her. Underneath the shrieking, I could hear the sounds of the disaster playing out in my former foyer. I heard Derek's voice low and shaking frantically, trying to manage his wife. He was murmuring desperate apologies, attempting to steer her away from the open hallway. But the deeper devastation came through in the other voices threading into the call. I could make out the sharp, distinct tones of Priya's parents. They were not speaking with the gracious, forgiving patience of guests who had encountered a simple mix-up. They were speaking with undisguised disgust. I heard her father ask in a voice thick with wealthy entitlement what kind of pathetic farce this was supposed to be. I heard her mother complain about the temperature of the house, stating plainly that she had not come all this way to stand in a cold, barren room. Their confusion was curdling rapidly into contempt. The social capital Derek had intended to purchase with his mother's unpaid labor was evaporating in real time. Priya shrieked again, demanding that I pick up the phone. She insisted I tell her exactly when the caterers were coming to salvage this disaster. I did not respond right away. I lifted my wine glass and took a slow, unhurried sip. The wine was cold, crisp, and precisely balanced. I swallowed, letting the deep quiet of the balcony stretch out across the open line. The silence did the work for me. It forced the frantic, panicking group huddled in my cold suburban hallway outside Atlanta to hear the unmistakable sound of the crashing Atlantic surf and the gentle rustle of palm fronds through the speaker. When I finally spoke, I drained every trace of feeling from my voice. No anger, no satisfaction. Pure glacial clarity, each syllable measured and placed like a judge delivering a final ruling. I addressed Priya directly. I told her that she was standing in a house she did not own, searching for a table that had been permanently liquidated and expecting a meal from a woman she had considered too beneath her to share a room with. I let those facts sit on the line. I heard a sharp breath from Derek, but I did not stop. I informed her that no caterers were on their way. The fiction she had tried to build on the foundation of my wife's physical pain was officially over. I spoke deliberately, making certain that her parents standing right there behind her caught every word of my accounting. Then I turned to her frantic questions about the food. I told her that if she stepped into the kitchen and opened the large pantry door, she would find the shelves fully loaded. I walked her through it precisely. I told her there were 12 lbs of raw sweet potatoes waiting to be peeled and mashed. I told her there was flour yeast and water for the artisanal brioche she had so specifically demanded. I told her there were hand-seared foie gras and fig compote sitting on the counter. I explained that an organic heritage breed turkey was resting in the deep freezer, frozen completely solid. I kept my tone perfectly level as I delivered the final instruction. I told Priya that she had furnished an extraordinarily detailed minute-by-minute schedule for an 18-dish culinary production. Since she possessed the vision, she was entirely at liberty to push up the sleeves of her designer cashmere coat and prepare every single one of those 18 dishes herself. The kitchen was hers to command. She had exactly 3 hours before her parents would expect dinner on the table. The silence that followed was complete. The shrieking stopped dead. The low murmuring from the wealthy in-laws cut off without warning. The raw, undeniable reality of her situation had finally forced its way through the thick walls of Priya's narcissism. She understood now that she was not speaking to a compliant, accommodating father-in-law. She was speaking to a man who had orchestrated her complete and very public humiliation with surgical precision. Derek found his voice. He took the phone from his wife. The arrogant, commanding bark of the corporate climber who had brushed me aside in his corner office was completely gone. What came through the speaker instead was the shaking, desperate plea of a man who had just realized he was in free fall with nothing to grab onto. He called me Dad. He used the word like a rope thrown over a cliff, a frantic attempt to invoke a bond he had personally dismantled. He begged me to tell him this was some kind of error. He asked where the funds in the emergency account had gone. He asked why the leasing company had just called about repossessing his vehicle. He begged me to come back and contain the situation before the angry people in the hallway cost him his career permanently. I listened to all of it. I felt no pity. No paternal instinct stirred in me. The man on the other end of that line was a stranger who had tried to extract my wife's dignity as a career tool. I answered him in the same flat transactional register I had used with his wife. I told him that an auditor's function is to identify fraudulent assets and remove them from the ledger. I told him that he had chosen to treat his parents as expendable resources, and those resources had simply chosen to dispose of him in return. I informed him that a security team would be changing the locks on the house the following morning. I advised him to collect whatever personal belongings he and his wife had left in the guest room and vacate the property before law enforcement was called to remove trespassers. Derek attempted to speak again, a chaotic tangle of apologies, excuses about pressure and stress and misunderstandings. He tried to claim that he loved us, that this had all been a terrible miscommunication. I did not let him reach the end of the sentence. I reached forward and pressed the red button on the screen. The connection dropped instantly. The panicked voices, the desperate words, the ambient noise of a collapsing fabrication, all of it cuts away in a single second. The phone went dark. The only sounds left on the balcony were the steady rhythmic crash of the ocean and the soft movement of the warm coastal wind. I picked up my wine glass. I looked across the table at Elaine. She was watching the phone, her hands resting quietly in her lap. A deep and settled peace had come over her face. The invisible weight she had carried through a lifetime of unacknowledged service was gone. She reached across the glass table and took my hand. There was nothing to discuss about the call, nothing to dissect about the panic we had just witnessed. The ledger was balanced. The audit was complete. I pressed her hand, raised my glass toward the sinking sun, and let myself feel the warmth of the evening for the first time in years. Before all of that, before the final severance, the frantic noise pouring through the speaker had shifted. Priya's high-pitched shrieking was suddenly muffled, then cut off. In its place came the heavy, aggressive sound of a physical struggle over the phone. Through the live feed on my tablet, I watched Derek lunge forward and wrench the device from Priya's trembling hands. He brought it up to his face. His knuckles were white against the dark casing. His jaw was locked in that familiar tense set he used to intimidate people who worked beneath him. He did not ask what was happening. He did not stop to wonder if his mother was safe or whether there had been some kind of emergency. He went straight into a volley of furious, entitled commands. His voice rang out in the empty dining room, bouncing hard off the bare walls. He ordered me to turn the car around immediately. He demanded that I drive back to the house, apologize to his wife, and repair this catastrophic humiliation at once. He spoke with the blind, self-assured confidence of a man who genuinely believed he still held every card. He told me I was putting his career at risk. He told me his in-laws were right there watching, and that my little stunt was making him look like an absolute fool. He ordered me to fix it. He actually used the word order. I let him run through the whole tirade. Then, I let the silence sit across the encrypted connection long enough for the quiet sound of the St. Simon's Island surf, and the gentle rustle of palm fronds to carry through the speaker into that cold, hollow house. I wanted him to feel the distance between us. I wanted him to understand that his commands were reaching no one. When I finally spoke, the fatherly warmth I had extended for 35 years was completely absent from my voice. I spoke with the precise mechanical cadence of a seasoned auditor delivering a final and damning assessment. I told Derek to stop talking. The instruction was quiet, but it carried enough weight to cut straight through him. On the screen, I watched his posture give. The aggressive thrust of his shoulders folded inward. He stood motionless at the center of the empty room, waiting for what came next. He was entirely unprepared for what I was about to deliver. I informed him that our relationship was no longer a family matter. It was a permanent financial eviction. I told him to look out the front window at the gleaming black luxury vehicle sitting in the driveway. I described the fine leather interior and the polished custom rims. I reminded him how deliberately he had parked it there to make an impression on the wealthy people now standing behind him. My voice stayed cold and level. I notified him that exactly 24 hours prior, I had legally and permanently removed my name as the primary guarantor on that auto lease. I laid out the immediate and unavoidable consequences of that action. I told him the dealership had already flagged the account for serious default, given his lack of any independent credit standing. I informed him that by Monday morning, a commercial tow truck would pull up in front of Derek's downtown financial office in Midtown Atlanta and publicly repossess the vehicle he had never been able to afford on his own. I wanted Priya's parents to hear every last syllable of his financial ruin. I watched the camera feed as the color drained rapidly from Derek's face. His mouth fell open, some frantic, rehearsed excuse clearly forming, but I gave him no moment of grace. I moved straight to the most damning entry on my ledger. I told him I had devoted the last 40 years of my life to hunting corporate thieves. I told him I had spent decades staring down men who looted millions while dressed in expensive tailored suits. I told him I never imagined I'd find a cowardly common thief seated at my own kitchen table. Then I recited the exact dollar amount. I read the numbers aloud, enunciating every single digit of the sum he had methodically siphoned from Elaine's medical emergency fund. I told him he had deliberately stolen money set aside for his own mother's surgical recovery, all to bankroll his pathetic illusion of suburban wealth. Through the speaker, the silence that settled over that dining room became absolutely suffocating. The sheer moral bankruptcy of what he had done hung in the cold, stagnant air. I watched Priya's mother physically recoil. She took a distinct, deliberate step away from Derek, her face twisting with pure, unfiltered disgust. The wealthy investors Derek had been so desperate to impress were now listening to irrefutable proof that their son-in-law was a common predator who had robbed his own crippled mother. Derek's voice cracked. He stammered, groping for a lie, calling it a temporary loan, a brief transfer, a terrible misunderstanding. I ignored every word of his pathetic defense. I delivered the final fatal blow to the reality he had constructed. I told him the financial safety net he had relied on his entire life had been reduced to ash. I informed him that the joint accounts were permanently frozen, drained, and transferred into an impenetrable offshore trust. I told him my last will and testament had been fully rewritten and legally certified by my attorney. I explained that the extensive estate he had spent years waiting to inherit, the wealth he felt so aggressively entitled to claim, had been entirely redirected. Those funds would now go to a national foundation dedicated to protecting elderly victims from familial abuse. I told him he was excised. I told him he had been completely erased from our future ledgers. He had chosen to value a fabricated social image over the physical dignity of his own family, so now he would be forced to fund that empty image entirely on his own. I watched the high-definition tablet screen as the absolute finality of my words landed in his mind. The financial guillotine had dropped swift, clean, and permanent. The illusion was severed. Derek's hand began to tremble uncontrollably. His fingers went slack, losing all their grip. The cell phone slipped from his hand. I watched the device fall in a slow, devastating arc. It plummeted toward the dusty hardwood floor. The sharp crack of impact echoed through the connection just before the line went completely dead. The call was over. I kept my eyes fixed on the silent video feed. The phone lay abandoned on the floorboards. Derek did not reach down to retrieve it. He stood frozen, staring blankly at the empty space where the massive mahogany table used to sit. His arms hung uselessly at his sides. That expensive tailored wool overcoat suddenly looked far too large for his collapsing frame. Behind him, the entire dynamic of the room had shifted permanently. Priya stood with both hands covering her mouth, eyes wide with a potent mixture of horror and profound social embarrassment. Her parents did not move to comfort her. They offered not a single word of support to the man standing before them. Priya's father stared directly at Derek. His expression was a flawless portrait of absolute, unforgiving judgment. He was looking at a man stripped entirely of his armor, a man exposed as a hollow, bankrupt fraud. The majestic holiday gathering was in ruins. There would be no triumphant dinner. There would be no strategic corporate alliance forged over roasted turkey and expensive wine. There would only be the brutal, devastating reality of a man left to explain to his furious wife and disgusted in-laws how he had managed to lose everything in a matter of minutes. I watched them standing in the freezing, empty cavern of that dining room. They looked like strangers trapped in a museum dedicated to their own failures. I reached out and quietly closed the security application. The bright screen went dark, reflecting nothing but the blue St. Simon's Island sky. The extraction was officially complete. I leaned back in the comfortable rattan chair. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady, peaceful rhythm of the Atlantic waves rolling against the shore. Elaine rested her hand over mine. The air was warm. The ledger was clean. The future belonged entirely to us. 2 weeks drifted by beneath the warm, sheltering canopy of the Georgia coast sky. For Conrad and Elaine, the passage of time was no longer marked by frantic deadlines or the crushing expectations of ungrateful children. Days melted one into the next, settling into a seamless, comforting rhythm of quiet sunrise walks along the pristine beach and warm evenings spent watching the tide roll in. The transformation in Elaine was nothing short of miraculous. The rigid medical brace she had worn for painful months was discarded in the far corner of the closet entirely unnecessary now that she was free from the brutal physical labor of maintaining a home she had been despised in. She walked with a newfound lightness that brought a deep aching joy to Conrad's chest. He watched her sip fresh local coffee on the balcony, her face glowing with genuine peace as the morning sun warmed her skin. They were healing in the quiet light, letting the salt air wash away the toxic, heavy residue of a lifetime spent trying to earn a love that had never truly been theirs to claim. The days were theirs alone, governed only by the rise and fall of the sun and the shifting ocean tides. In the digital ether connecting the remote island to the bustling mainland, a graveyard of panic was slowly and aggressively accumulating. Conrad kept his cell phone locked in the heavy mahogany desk drawer, checking it only once a day to confirm the legal barriers he had built remained firmly in place. The voicemail inbox was a descending chronicle of raw, unfiltered desperation. The first few days featured Derek demanding immediate explanations, his voice thick with the arrogant assumption that his father would eventually cave and return to fix the mess. By the second week, that tone had collapsed into panicked, breathless pleading. The messages piled up one after another, weighted with the frantic, sickening realization that the financial safety net was truly burned to nothing. Priya left voicemails too, shedding her manufactured high society polish for raw, shrill hysteria. Conrad listened to them with the dispassionate clinical detachment of a stranger evaluating a failing asset. He did not feel the familiar pull of parental guilt. He felt nothing but the calm, solid certainty that he had finally done the right thing for his own survival. He deleted each message with a quiet tap of his finger, refusing to let their noise infect his tranquil sanctuary. Back in the sprawling concrete maze of the city, the total collapse of Derek's empire was unfolding with spectacular surgical precision. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in the middle of the crowded Midtown Atlanta corporate plaza. Derek had parked his leased luxury vehicle in the prime spot, reserved strictly for junior executives. He had walked into the towering glass structure, projecting the polished image of a man destined for the highest echelons of power. At exactly 10 in the morning, a heavy industrial tow truck rolled into the pristine Midtown Atlanta corporate plaza courtyard. The loud grinding roar of the diesel engine shattered the professional quiet. Derek was in the middle of a critical strategy meeting, seated across from his senior partners in a glass-walled conference room. He watched in slow, horrified motion as the tow truck driver casually backed up to the gleaming black vehicle. Heavy metal hooks were clamped loudly onto the pristine undercarriage. Bright yellow warning lights flashed violently, their reflection strobing across the polished office windows for everyone to see. Panic seized Derek by the throat. He abandoned the meeting entirely, sprinting out of the conference room and rushing down the stairs to the street. He burst through the revolving glass doors, demanding the driver halt the repossession immediately. He shouted desperately about misunderstandings and temporary banking errors, blindly trying to save face. The driver, completely unimpressed by the expensive designer suit, handed Derek a laminated legal notice. The document detailed the severe financial default and the total permanent withdrawal of the primary financial guarantor. The scene drew a substantial, eager crowd. Junior analysts and senior partners alike gathered near the expansive lobby windows, watching the firm's golden boy publicly stripped of his manufactured wealth. The hydraulic lift engaged with a loud mechanical whine, hoisting the luxury vehicle skyward. Derek stood frozen on the cold concrete, gutted by the sheer scale of the public humiliation. The polished armor of his manufactured success had been stripped away in broad daylight, exposing him as a complete fraud to the very crowd he had sold his soul to impress. The public repossession was only the opening act of his total, undeniable unraveling. The truly fatal blow came from the very network he had betrayed his parents to gain entry to. Priya's parents had spent the 2 weeks since the Thanksgiving disaster running a quiet, ruthless investigation into their son-in-law's actual financial standing. The empty, freezing dining room had shattered their trust completely, and what the subsequent financial digging revealed transformed their initial bewilderment into cold, calculating fury. They uncovered the full scope of his dangerous leverage, the staggering accumulated debts, and the utter absence of independent capital. The realization landed with profound disgust. They had handed their only daughter to a hollow man whose entire existence was secretly bankrolled by the elderly parents he so openly held in contempt. They did not phone Derek to register their disappointment or extend any guidance. Wealthy people do not squander breath or time on fundamentally bad investments. They simply moved. Priya's father was a primary critical investor in Derek's firm, holding substantial capital across several key portfolios. On Wednesday morning, formal certified notices of immediate withdrawal landed on the desks of the firm's managing directors. The capital was pulled in its entirety, not a single word of negotiation exchanged. The relationship was severed with brutal, unapologetic finality. The senior partners called Derek up to the top-floor executive suite shortly after the lunch hour. The atmosphere in that room was completely stripped of its usual fraternal warmth and corporate camaraderie. They told him flatly that his personal financial instability, combined with the sudden hostile withdrawal of his primary familial investors, made him an unacceptable toxic liability to the firm. He was not offered a generous severance package. He was not extended a graceful transition period to save face or locate other employment. He was handed a flat cardboard box and given exactly 20 minutes to clear his desk under the close, unyielding watch of corporate security. Derek carried his solitary cardboard box toward the main elevators. The carpeted hallway felt 1,000 miles long, an endless gauntlet of shame. The same ambitious colleagues who had eagerly sought his counsel just weeks earlier now rapidly averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply absorbed in their computer monitors. He was a pariah infected with the fatal corporate disease of public exposure. He stepped into the elevator and watched the brushed steel doors slide shut, closing the final chapter on the career he had arrogantly believed was entirely his own brilliant creation. He had genuinely believed he was a self-made giant conquering the financial world. He understood too late as the elevator dropped toward the ground floor that he was nothing more than a fragile paper kite, sustained solely by the steady wind of his father's silent, endless generosity. Now the wind had stopped entirely, and gravity was collecting its inevitable due. He rode a crowded commuter train back to the affluent suburbs, arriving at the sprawling house that now felt exactly like a massive prison. He walked slowly up the long paved driveway, staring blankly at the empty space where his luxury vehicle had sat just hours before. He unlocked the heavy front door, bracing for the thick, suffocating silence within. Instead, the house was in a state of frantic, chaotic motion. Priya was moving swiftly between the master bedroom and the grand sweeping staircase. Two massive, expensive designer suitcases sat heavily by the front door, packed to the absolute brim. She wore her expensive tailored coat, her car keys gripped in a white-knuckled fist. Derek dropped his cardboard box on the foyer floorboards and asked what she was doing. Priya did not look at him with any sympathy or the foundational support of love a spouse should offer in a moment of absolute ruin. She regarded him with the exact same cold, judgmental disgust her wealthy father had projected. She informed him without a single tremor of emotion that she was leaving him immediately. She told him she absolutely refused to be shackled to a pathetic man who had lied about his worth and humiliated her family in front of their entire prestigious social circle. She declared firmly that she was returning to Priya's parents' estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, and that her elite lawyers would be in contact with him by the end of the week to formally begin the divorce proceedings. She did not wait for his defense. She did not listen to his desperate, frantic apologies reverberating through the hallway. She picked up her heavy bags and walked straight out the front door, pulling it firmly and decisively shut behind her. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt echoed loudly through the empty foyer. Derek stood completely alone in the center of the massive mortgaged house he could no longer possibly afford to keep. He walked slowly into the formal dining room. The space was still painfully bare, the polished hardwood floors throwing back the sound of his slow, heavy, defeated footsteps. He looked at the exact spot where his father's final white note had rested 2 weeks ago. He was entirely, completely, and utterly alone. The grand, flawless facade had been thoroughly annihilated, ground into dust, beneath the immense weight of its own vanity. He fell to his knees in the center of the empty room, the crushing weight of his fully deserved reality finally pressing down on his shoulders, burying the very last fragile fragments of his arrogance in the dark, quiet shadows of his ruined life. 3 weeks after the flight to Amelia Island, Florida, Conrad and Elaine finally returned to their suburban home outside Atlanta. The heavy wooden front door swung open to reveal a house that had been entirely purged of its former toxic weight. The air inside was crisp and clean, carrying the sharp, distinct scent of fresh winter pine, and the lingering cold of a building held in absolute stillness. There was no trace of the manufactured holiday panic that used to infect these walls. Elaine walked into the empty foyer, setting her travel bag down on the polished floorboards with a quiet thud. She did not immediately rush to inspect the kitchen or check the surfaces for dust. She simply stood in the center of the room, breathing in the quiet tranquility of a space they had successfully reclaimed. Conrad locked the door behind them, letting the solid metallic click settle through the hallway. A profound sense of closure wrapped around him like a heavy protective coat. They spent the first few days easing back into a routine dictated entirely by their own desires. They drank coffee in the morning light, watching the frost melt off the bare branches of the oak trees in the backyard. They read books by the fireplace, listening to the gentle crackle of burning wood instead of the shrill, demanding ring of a cellular phone. The massive empty space in the formal dining room remained exactly as they had left it, a beautiful silent monument to their liberation. Conrad had no intention of buying another mahogany table. He preferred the open room. It served as a daily reminder of the heavy burdens they no longer had to carry. The peace was absolute and uninterrupted until late Thursday afternoon. The sky outside had turned a bruised shade of violet as the winter sun began to dip below the neighborhood rooftops. Conrad was in his study reviewing his updated financial portfolios when a heavy, desperate knocking rang out from the front porch. The sound was nothing like the polite, measured rap of a delivery driver or a visiting neighbor. It was a frantic, hollow pounding. It was the sound of a man who had completely run out of options. Conrad closed his laptop and walked slowly down the hallway. Elaine stepped out of the kitchen, her eyes finding his, a silent, unspoken understanding passing between them. She did not look afraid. She simply nodded and stepped back, allowing him to handle the final piece of their necessary extraction. Conrad approached the front door. He did not unlock the heavy brass deadbolt. He leaned forward and looked through the small glass pane. Derek stood on the concrete porch. The physical transformation of his son was stark and undeniable. The polished, arrogant corporate executive who had confidently marched up these very steps on Thanksgiving Day was entirely gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out shadow of a man. His expensive tailored wool suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with winter slush. His tie hung loosely around his neck like a broken leash. His hair was unkempt, and his face was drawn pale and lined with the heavy, exhausting weight of total financial ruin. He looked utterly broken, shivering slightly in the freezing wind. Conrad opened the solid wooden door, but kept the reinforced steel mesh screen firmly locked between them. The heavy metal grate served as a perfect physical manifestation of the boundary he had permanently erected. The freezing winter air rushed into the foyer, carrying the desperate scent of his son's panic. Derek looked up. The rims of his eyes were raw and red, brimming with tears he hadn't yet let fall, his whole body radiating the trapped desperation of something that knew it was caught. The moment he spotted Conrad through the steel mesh, the pleading started. Derek's words tumbled out in a breathless, colliding rush. He wanted forgiveness. He wanted that door open so he could get out of the freezing night air. He said he'd lost every last thing he owned. He laid out his ruin in a trembling, near-hysterical voice, the whole catastrophic sequence of it. Priya had served him divorce papers and moved back to Priya's parents' estate in Buckhead, Atlanta. Her father had gone to work, making sure Derek's name was mud at every serious financial firm in the city. The bank accounts were in the red, his credit score was rubble, and the leasing company had already sent legal threats about the vehicle they'd hauled away. There he was on that frozen porch, tears running freely explaining how he'd burned through the last of his options, bedding down in a cut-rate motel room until the final credit card he owned got cut off at the register. Conrad didn't move a muscle behind the metal mesh. He took in the whole sorry inventory of catastrophes and felt nothing resembling a father's instinct to help. He was watching the same man who had cheerfully drawn up plans to humiliate his mother in exchange for a career bump, now reduced to pleading for a heated room. Derek could see the tears weren't landing, so he changed his angle. He crowded closer to the screen and began offloading responsibility onto anyone but himself. He'd been used, he said. Priya was to blame. Her insatiable taste for high-end everything had buried him in debt he couldn't climb out of. Her family had crushed him under the weight of expectations nobody could realistically meet. The environment at the firm had been poisonous, he said. The pressure had warped his thinking and stripped away what mattered. He told Conrad he'd never wanted anyone to get hurt. He was just a man trying to stay afloat in a world that showed no mercy, a victim of forces outside his control. He reached back into their shared history, dredging up warm memories from his childhood, as if sentimentality might unlock a wire transfer. Conrad let the quiet sit there long after Derek had nothing left to say. Around them, the wind cut across the porch and chased the final dead leaves over the hard, frozen ground. Conrad regarded his son through the barrier between them and experienced nothing except a clear, icy sense of resolution. When he spoke, it was without heat, without waver, a voice that had burned off every last degree of fatherly feeling. He said that blaming others was where cowards went to hide. Then he brought up a particular afternoon, 3 months back, the day Elaine had come through that same door, wearing a rigid brace on her knee, fresh from the hospital. Derek hadn't asked a single question about how the surgery had gone. Instead, he'd pushed for a check right then to secure the deposit on some vacation rental. Conrad also brought up the look on Derek's face, that curl of contempt when Elaine confessed the painkillers left her too worn out to put a proper dinner on the table. Nobody had made Derek act that way, Conrad told him. Priya hadn't authored his arrogance. Her parents hadn't built the hollow space inside him where basic empathy should have been. What Derek had done was a choice clear-eyed, deliberate, made with full knowledge to prioritize a manufactured image over the dignity of the people who raised him. An apology that only appeared once the money ran out was not something Conrad recognized as an apology. It was a transaction, a bid. He told Derek he carried zero guilt over pulling apart the comfortable fiction they'd all been living inside. The financial reckoning he'd engineered wasn't cruelty, he said. It was the bare minimum that fairness required. He'd built a safety net across a lifetime of work, Conrad went on, and he'd watched Derek stretch out in it like it was a hammock taking without conscience. That net no longer existed. Derek's hands shot out and seized the steel mesh. He told his father to stop, just stop talking and open the door. He had nothing left and nowhere to turn. Conrad held still. He reached into the deep inner pocket of his cardigan, unhurried, and drew out a thick ledger bound in leather. The previous 2 weeks on St. Simon's Island, Georgia had gone into building that document with meticulous care. It was a complete and airtight record, 5 years of their shared financial life, every entry accounted for. He moved toward the door. He fed the ledger through the wide brass mail slot set low in the doorframe. It landed on the frozen concrete at Derek's feet, right beside those expensive shoes that were now scuffed and wrecked beyond saving. Derek stared at it baffled and asked in a low, uncomprehending voice what he was supposed to do with a book. Conrad answered with the composure of someone who has worked out every column to zero. The ledger, he explained, held a line-by-line tally of every dollar Derek had siphoned out of Elaine's medical emergency fund. Every charge run up fraudulently on her cards, every month of subsidized rent. Every luxury item quietly paid for out of his parents' retirement savings. It was all there in black and white. The arithmetic didn't lie and couldn't be argued with. Then Conrad named his terms. That door would stay locked permanently until every cent recorded in those pages was paid back in full. Derek could take the ledger, locate some employment, find a modest apartment, and start the grinding, humbling work of supporting himself from the ground up. He could labor until the work wore him raw, and whatever remained of his ego was ground to dust. Once the debt was cleared, every last cent of it, maybe then they could talk about what it actually meant to earn someone's respect. Derek stood at the mesh jaw, slack, staring through it with an expression of mute, stunned horror. The realization arrived fully formed. There was no reserve of parental grace tucked away somewhere for him to draw on. The padded, forgiving world of his upbringing had given way entirely to something hard and merciless and exactly proportional. Conrad didn't linger for any response. He closed his hand around the heavy brass handle on the inner door. He met Derek's eyes, one final wordless look, nothing offered in it but the truth, and then he swung the door shut behind him. The dense impact of wood finding its frame carried a weight that went beyond sound. The deadbolt turned with a clean metallic crack, and just like that, the warmth of the house was sealed off entirely, leaving the dark and the cold on the outside of that door exactly where they belonged. Derek wrapped both hands around the freezing metal of the security screen and gripped it hard. His knuckles drained to white against the mesh. He pushed his face up close to the wire, trying to see through into the lit hallway. Every trace of the sleek professional surface he'd spent a decade constructing had been scraped away. What remained looked frantic and deeply empty. The tailored wool suit, once impeccable, was a creased, filthy mess marked by the gray slush of the streets. His silk tie hung loosely around his neck, resembling a broken leash rather than a symbol of power. The winter wind raked through him, and he shook with it. Then the words started again, spilling out in a continuous, stumbling, unstoppable stream. He talked about family, the way someone might recite a spell as if repeating the right word loudly enough could undo everything that had been done. Blood, he kept saying. Blood means something. He was trying to rope himself to a connection he had spent the better part of a decade treating as a resource to be drawn down. He framed it all as a young man's mistakes, pressure, bad judgment, one bad decision snowballing into the next. He asked for another chance. He asked to come inside and talk, just talk somewhere warm. He swore everything would change now that his wife had walked out on him. She had pushed him into it. He implied her ambition had been the engine of all of it, and he conveniently left out every moment where he had driven alongside her without hesitation. Conrad hadn't moved from the foyer. Winter air was seeping through the wooden door's frame and touching his face, but it didn't reach him. He watched the tears cut down his son's cheek. He registered the short, ragged pulls of breath. He took in the whole display with the same removed analytical attention a technician might give to a machine that had failed in a predictable way. For 35 years, watching his son fall apart would have sent him moving before the thought had even formed some wiring deep in him that fired automatically comfort. The boy solved the problem, take the hurt into himself. That wiring was dead. It had been cut through steadily by years of being treated as a convenience, and the final severance had come when Derek stole from Elaine's medical fund. When Conrad looked into his son's eyes now, what he found was nothing beyond bare animal self-interest. Derek wasn't weeping over what he had put his parents through. He was weeping because the cushioned, consequence-free life he'd constructed for himself had finally collapsed, and the ground underneath was exactly as hard as it should have been all along. Conrad did not raise his voice. He had no need to raise his voice above the howling wind. The quiet authority behind his words cut right through Derek's frantic noise without effort. He told Derek to stop talking and pay close attention, because what came next would be the last thing he ever said to him on this matter. Family and blood, he stated, were not some kind of protective charm that shielded a person from having to answer for what they had done. A real family, he explained, was something you constructed out of genuine mutual respect and the most basic decency one person could extend to another. He put it plainly to Derek. He had looked at his aging parents and seen not people but a reservoir to be drawn down for his own social climbing. Conrad's eyes moved to the trembling hands clenched around the metal mesh. Derek was no victim of anyone's manipulation, he told him. He had drawn up the blueprint for his own ruin and built it himself board by board. Then Conrad delivered the final truth, the one with no softness in it. A son who willingly trades his mother's physical health and comfort to finance a pathetic lie deserves to live entirely in the ruins of his own making. He called up the specific agonizing stretch of months that Elaine had spent in a rigid brace hobbling through her days because the money set aside for her surgery had been quietly siphoned away to fund a luxury rental. A man who calculates that kind of cruelty, he said, has forfeited any claim to the warmth of a family home. The bound leather ledger sitting on that frozen concrete porch, Conrad told him, held the exact accounting of every dollar taken. That ledger was now the only thread connecting them. Full repayment principal, and every cent of interest was what was owed. Until the balance reached zero, the door would not open. Derek's mouth moved, another wave of excuses already forming behind it. Nothing came out. Conrad's hand closed around the heavy brass handle of the inner door. There was no hesitation in him. No parting glance loaded with regret, no lingering moment of fatherly ambivalence. He pulled the thick oak door closed in one smooth, unhurried motion. The solid wood seated itself in the frame with a dense final thud that moved through the quiet foyer like a period at the end of a very long sentence. He turned the brass deadbolt. The mechanism clicked sharp, clean, loud in the stillness. It was the sound of a line being drawn in permanence. The physical enactment of a wall that existed now in every dimension, one that would never come down. Conrad stood in the hallway and let that quiet settle over him completely. Everything frantic and desperate that had contaminated the front porch was now sealed on the other side of that door where it would stay. He moved into the darkened living room and positioned himself by the front window, looking out through the sheer linen curtains. The streetlights threw long, pale streaks across the frost-covered lawn. He watched Derek stand motionless on the porch, staring at the closed door, the full weight of his permanent exile working its way into him slowly. His shoulders gave. He turned and descended the brick steps with the stiffness of a man who had stopped pretending. His expensive leather shoes found no grip on the icy driveway. He walked with the heavy dragging gait of someone carrying a load that wasn't going to get lighter. He moved off down the quiet street, away from the only genuine safety net that had ever existed for him. Conrad watched until the darkness swallowed him entirely. There was no pull to call him back, no hollow ache of wondering whether he'd failed as a father. What he felt instead was the clean, precise relief of a necessary amputation, the right cut made at the right time. He turned from the window and walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen. The whole character of the house had shifted. The chill of panic and cold night air that had seeped in was gone, replaced by the deep settling comfort of pine and simmering tea. He stepped into the kitchen and paused in the doorway. Elaine was at the marble counter. The rigid medical brace, that months-long fixture, was nowhere to be seen. She was standing upright, her posture easy and natural, nothing bracing against anything. She moved with a loose, unhurried grace he hadn't seen from her in close to a decade. The tension that used to wire itself through her spine every holiday season had simply dissolved. Her surgery funds had been made whole, and the procedure was already on the calendar for the following month. She was arranging vibrant, colorful sunflowers in a simple, tall ceramic vase, the bright yellow blooms vivid against the clean lines of the kitchen. She glanced up when Conrad came in her eyes, clear and unguarded, none of the low-level anxiety that had lived in them for so long. He crossed the room. His arms went around her waist, and he pressed a slow, gentle kiss to her forehead. Her skin was warm, carrying the faint scent of lavender and vanilla. She leaned into him, her head finding his shoulder. They stood that way in the kitchen's quiet warmth, the refrigerator humming softly and the tea kettle murmuring on the stove. The enormous, oppressive dining room table was gone. The punishing cooking schedules were gone. The toxic, demanding presence of a son who had treated them as unpaid staff was gone for good. The house felt open and alive, drawing breath again after years of being held tight. Conrad carried 2 small porcelain mugs of hot tea to the modest, round wooden table tucked against the bay window, a table built for 2 and nothing more. Elaine set the ceramic vase of sunflowers at its center. They settled into their chairs and looked out at the frozen backyard, the winter moon laying its silver light across everything. The house held a complete, unbroken silence. It was nothing like the heavy, suffocating silence that had come with years of swallowed resentment and endured humiliation. This was something else entirely wide and clean and full of air, the silence of people who no longer owed anything to anyone. They drank their tea and let the warmth move through them. The man walking in the cold outside did not need to be discussed. The past did not need to be revisited. That's where the story comes to rest. Not with shouting, not with dramatics, but with a deadbolt turning and 2 mugs of tea sitting on a table built for 2. I've thought a long time about what all of this cost. It cost me the version of my son I had spent decades hoping he might still become. It cost Elaine years of pain she should never have had to carry, but I believe God doesn't let that kind of quiet suffering go unanswered forever. The Lord's timing isn't always the timing we would choose, but looking back, every door that closed at the right moment led us somewhere we actually deserve to be. What we found on the other side of all of it was something we hadn't felt in years room to breathe. If this family revenge story reached something in you, here is what I'd want you to carry forward. First, loyalty is not the same thing as tolerance. You can love someone and still refuse to be used by them. Second, document everything. A quiet, careful record is more powerful than any argument you could make in the heat of the moment. Third, when someone shows you repeatedly and deliberately that your dignity is negotiable to them, believe what they're showing you. And fourth, for anyone in the adults, 50-plus chapter of life who has ever felt invisible in their own home, your comfort is not a burden, and you are not obligated to shrink. If this story moved you, I hope you'll leave a comment below and tell me what you took from it. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, there are more stories here waiting for you, and every one of them is worth your time. Thank you sincerely for spending yours with me. Until next time, take care of yourself.